everyone. Welcome to the Learning and Retirement series. I'm back again. Today, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Lila Halstead, and she is an assistant professor of art history in the art department at Davidson. She earned her PhD at the Institute of Fine Arts in NYU and her MA at UNC Chapel Hill. She is also a Davidson alumna, class of 2014. As a first-year student at Davidson, she enrolled in Job Thomas's art history course, and the rest is history. This course instilled a passion for art history of the Islamic world that she pursued in her graduate work and is now sharing with today's Davidson students. Lila and I spoke earlier this month about her return to Davidson as a faculty member. She is very excited about the interest that the current students are showing in art history. Her approach to teaching gives students the ability to think critically about the historical context of art and the many ways in which art reflects the culture and the events of the times. This spring, she will be leading a spring break trip to Spain to give her students an opportunity to experience and explore the art created through the ages in that part of the world. Lucky, lucky students. Today, Lila will take us on a journey to explore the mystery of Arabic block printing. Welcome to the Pines, Lila.
Thank you so much, Verna, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for being here. I'm so excited to be here speaking at the Pines today. So my talk today is called A Medieval Mystery, Arabic Block Printing. Now, when I speak about printmaking and the printmaking tradition to students at conferences as part of my research, often what you might imagine is the Western tradition. So you might think of Europe, you might think of Germany, you might think of movable type. Less often do people think of the Islamic world as part of the formative history of printmaking. So today, to kind of illustrate for you some of the mysteries of printmaking in the Islamic tradition, in the medieval Islamic world, I'm going to use this artifact. It's a scroll, paper scroll, in the Museum for Islamische Kunst in Berlin. I'm going to use this as sort of a demonstrative example of the tradition I'll be talking about. And this is also a scroll that I have translated and that I've been working on in my own research. This is a printed artifact, but you'll also notice the dates 11th to 13th century. That's quite a long time before Gutenberg. Okay, so when we think of printmaking, again, when we think of movable type, we often think of Germany, Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century. We might think of the Gutenberg Bible and the ability to produce and mass produce texts through the medium of printing. If we know, maybe we dig a little bit further into the printmaking tradition, we might learn that in fact printmaking didn't originate in Europe. It originated much further east, okay, in China. I see many of you nodding your heads. So this is an example of a block printed image as part of a larger text, the Diamond Sutra, produced in 9th century Tang Dynasty China. So we know that actually printmaking likely originated in East Asia. Now, this kind of printmaking is a little bit different from the movable type we see with Gutenberg. So just for those of you who might not be familiar, just to illustrate this for you. This kind of printmaking is called block printing. When it uses a wooden block, we can call it woodcut. So you can see here, you have a wooden block, and you have a design that can then be traced onto the block. And then you carve away pieces of wood, okay, around the image. Okay, this is a relief printmaking technique. Then you ink the block, you apply the paper, and you have the print. Okay, so this was produced using that kind of method, using a woodcut. And this is, if you take a look at it, you can see this is quite a sophisticated print. Okay, and if you've ever practiced printmaking, if you've ever worked with this kind of technique, it's very difficult. And if you make a mistake, you have to start over. Okay, so these really fine lines, these details, this is not the beginning of the tradition in China. This is clearly showing quite an advanced understanding of this technique of production. Okay, again, in the 9th century. Now, we do have some evidence actually from China as early as the 11th century of some experiments with something that is akin to movable type. Okay, so even movable type we can trace potentially to China. So the question is, we have this happening in China, and then we have Gutenberg, but what happened in between? And how did this get there? And that's sort of going to be one of the things I try to sketch out for you today. So I have here a map of the transmission of paper, okay, paper making, which is important to our discussion because everything I'm going to show you is printed onto paper, okay? And paper, what a surprise, also originated in East Asia. And I've included this map to show you the sort of mode of transmission along the Silk Road of paper, okay, from East Asia, okay, through Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, into North Africa, and eventually into Europe. And what I'm going to present to you today is a similar trajectory for printmaking, okay, which follows shortly after paper production. So we see by the 10th century in Egypt, we have paper. And as I'm going to show you, shortly after that in Egypt, we have printmaking. Okay. And when I'm talking about Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean in this time, we have many different medieval Islamic dynasties. The dynasty in particular that I'm going to be talking about is called the Fatimid Caliphate. This was a relatively short-lived dynasty. They only ruled for about 200 years in Egypt and North Africa, with their capital at Al-Qahira, or Cairo, as you know it today. Now, the reason that Egypt is so important to a discussion of printmaking is that that is where we've actually uncovered in archaeological excavations most of the medieval Islamic block prints. And this is probably the only exception to what I said about paper. These are actually not on paper, these are textiles. These are 2 block printed cotton textiles. So they're pieces of cotton, they're fabric. The images you see, the designs, were printed onto them. Okay. And these were excavated, you can see, in the same place, Fustat, which is part of Greater Cairo. Now, these are really interesting. These are both in the Met today. If you're interested, you can always go take a look at them in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. These are interesting because they may give us a hint of how printmaking arrived in Egypt. We don't know. The short story is we don't know. The longer answer is that these printed textiles likely were not made in Egypt because the designs they employ come from India, from Gujarat. Okay. And so we have some suggestions in the archaeological record that perhaps, one theory is that printmaking arrived in Egypt through the importing of block printed textiles, and that then block printing took off in Egypt. Now we have other, of course, kinds of printed materials from Egypt, again from Fustat excavations. This is one example. This is also in the Met. And this is, of course, just an image of an animal, a printed ibex, and you can see it's a fragment. There's pieces missing. This is a fairly simple block print, right? This is not what we saw with the Diamond Sutra. We have no idea what this is. We have no idea why this is. We have no idea what it was part of. And that's one of the exciting things about studying Arabic block printing. These kinds of artifacts were excavated from as early as the 1920s. So they have been known for some time, about 100 years. But in that time, only in the last 10 years has there been significant scholarly interest in understanding the tradition. How were these things made? Where? Why? How were the designs determined? What is their significance? So there are still many, many mysteries left to uncover here. Now, this is in the minority, these kinds of printed images. What we see more often are printed texts and a very particular type of printed text. So these are 2 examples here, and you can see Arabic inscriptions, again, all printed. And you can imagine how difficult it is to produce this kind of print, but also, I know this very well, how difficult it is to read it, because this is not handwritten calligraphy, okay? So this is actually, they're very difficult to decipher. They are decipherable, but they are quite challenging. So we have another example here. Now, these are in every major museum collection around the world. There are over 100 printed artifacts from this time period, again, between the 11th and 14th centuries, is when we seem to have Arabic block printing. And I'll explain a little bit more later about how we have those dates. Part of it has to do with the archaeological excavations, which help us with dating, in what layers we determine, where we discover the works, the pieces of paper. Part of it has to do with some carbon dating. And believe it or not, most of these have never been carbon dated. They have never been chemically tested. It's a damaging process, so museums don't like to do it. The scroll that I showed you at the beginning that I'll focus on in Berlin, I've been trying to get it tested for many years. They are not going to do that. So this contributes, of course, to our lack of understanding about the precise dating of some of these things. So you'll notice that these are both labeled as amulets. Okay. These are actually quite small. So they're about like this big. They're portable. They're little. And the interesting thing about block printing, again, based on what we currently have to work with, what has been discovered, and of course, there's a lot of material culture that is missing, it's destroyed, it's lost, or we haven't uncovered it yet. But based on what we have, 99% of the block prints that survive from this time period are amulets. Okay, that ibex and the printed textiles are in the minority. And this is really interesting because in other parts of the world, printmaking was not used, especially for amulets. It seems to be something that perhaps was unique to the Arab Islamic world. Now, these kinds of amulets, this is another example of a printed amulet, they would be folded or rolled and then put in a case and then worn on the body. So this one, actually, they found it in the case. The case isn't in great condition. They had to crack it open to get the amulet out. This is a lead case, and this is a much fancier gold case. Okay, and we have many of these cases, and sometimes the amulets survive inside of the cases, which is really useful for us because we can understand how they were meant to be used, right? They were meant to be worn and carried. Okay. So this artifact that I showed you, this is an amulet scroll. This is much bigger, much longer than most of the others. It's one of the longest. It's about this long. Okay. It's quite long, it's quite thin. And if you look here, I have these red boxes. Those indicate where the print blocks are. So this was actually produced using likely 6 different print blocks. Okay, you can imagine something this long, it's difficult to print it with one block. And we'll talk a little bit more about why these different print blocks being used on the same scroll is significant, because I think it is. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit more about amulets as a type of artifact, as something that's important to many people throughout the world today. This is sort of a universal concept. Amulets date back to ancient Mesopotamia, and these are 2 ancient Egyptian examples. You've probably seen things like this, an ankh and the Wadjat eye, or the Eye of Horus. These are often worn in ancient Egypt, but also placed on mummified remains, okay, for protection in the afterlife. This idea of small portable objects, usually bearing images or maybe texts that can protect you, it is a virtually universal concept. It manifests differently in different cultures. We have different kinds of amulets, different kinds of images, different kinds of protective materials, but it's found in so many different cultures and dates to antiquity. A little bit later, we have actually pre-Islamic amulet scrolls. Okay, these are from 6th to 8th century BCE. These are silver, actually, amulets. And here we have a gold amulet. And this one's really interesting. It's Roman, it's from the 3rd century. This actually offers protection specifically from epilepsy. And this is quite interesting because, as I'll show you on the Berlin scroll I'm focusing on, we have some very similar specific physical concerns that are listed. So in some cases, these amulets tell us what they're meant for, what they're used for, and often they're used to protect your body, okay, either from malicious forces or from illness, which, by the way, in the pre-modern world was often attributed to malicious forces, right? Now, these, of course, were not printed, as you can probably tell. This example is a little bit different. This is a gold amulet. This was actually produced through a process called blind printing, which is not the same as woodcut. This is a metal amulet, but it's produced through a process where you basically impress the letters into the amulet. Okay, so it's similar in that there's a process of stamping and sealing, like we see with block printing or woodcut. Now, in the Islamic world, of course, we have many kinds of amulets. They often involve some kind of text or images as well. So here I have a stone amulet. This is a small, it's about this big, stone carnelian seal. So it's a red stone. And you can see it has some interesting images. So we have a star, we have some like indecipherable language. And this is not Arabic, this is actually indecipherable. Okay. So sometimes indecipherable texts or scripts, because they're mysterious, because they're esoteric, are believed to carry certain protective qualities. In this example, this is actually really interesting. This is a clay bulla. So it was a piece of wet clay that was pressed with an image. And you can see here the image of a lion. There's actually a scorpion here, 3 stars, and then Arabic inscriptions around it. And this is an amulet. It would have been carried, it's about, again, this big, carried as an amulet, but also it was pressed and sealed. It was produced through the act of creating an impression. And this seems to be significant when we consider that most of the amulets were printed. There's something to do with the process of replication, printing, stamping, sealing, and protection, at least in this Islamic context. Now, we rarely have any depictions, any paintings of amulet production. There is, in fact, only one that is known to us, and it's this one. Now, this is a very, very famous page from a very, very famous manuscript. This is a text called the Maghamat of al-Hariri, which translates roughly to the Assemblies of al-Hariri. It's a series of stories about a lovable rogue, Abu Zaid, is depicted here. You can see him in detail, who is a charlatan and a rogue, and he likes to masquerade. And so in every story in this text, he's pretending to be someone else. He's pretending to be a scholar. He's pretending, in this case, to be an amulet maker. And at some point in the story, he's found out. And then the audience realizes, oh my gosh, it's Abu Zaid. How did we not recognize him? Okay, and the audience goes on this journey for many, many, many stories. So in this story, we see actually Abu Zaid here, you see there's some paper in his lap. And you can see he's in the process of writing. He's writing an amulet. So he's not printing an amulet, he's handwriting an amulet. And he's doing that because he's pretending to be an amulet maker to aid this woman down here, who you can see is in the process of giving birth. Okay, this is a difficult childbirth. This is actually, fun fact, probably the only full frontal depiction of childbirth in the Islamic tradition. It's quite interesting. I like to show it to students because they're always shocked that this exists. This is the midwife, okay, who has her hand out here to try to assist the ailing mother. Of course, in the medieval world, the pre-modern world, still today, childbirth is a huge concern, right? There was very high mortality rates for both mothers and infants. And so this was always a point of anxiety. And in this time period, in the 13th century, there's only so much you can do with a difficult childbirth, right, to remedy it. And so one of the things that seems to have been very popular is the use of amulets, particularly therapeutic amulets, medicinal amulets, to try to aid in the childbirth. In this case, Abu Zaid comes across this house and offers to help. And so he writes this amulet and he has it, the text tells us, he ties it to the woman's inner thigh near the place where she's giving birth. And lo and behold, the child is born. Now, the joke is that Abu Zaid's amulet actually is a warning to the child. The earth is a terrible place. You don't want to be born. Stay in the womb. Okay, so there's a layer of humor to this. It's a fraudulent amulet, but that it appears at all that this is a story that is included in a 13th century text implies, if Abu Zaid is masquerading as an amulet maker, it implies that amulet makers were doing these kinds of things, legitimate ones, right? So this is actually a very, very rare example, and I'll come back to it because it actually plays into the printed amulets a little bit as well. So these block printed amulets, they appear to date again to around 10th, 11th century, and at the 14th century, they're gone. We have no more. Now, again, this is a talk about mystery. We don't know why. We do know that much later, in the 19th, 20th century, in the Ottoman lands, we start having more modern printmaking techniques like lithography. We have, of course, some influence from Europe coming into play. But we don't know why this practice appears, based on our surviving evidence, to have fallen out of fashion. There's no clarity there. We do have handwritten amulets after that time, but we also had handwritten amulets while these printed amulets are being produced. Okay, they're just less numerous. So these kinds of amulets, we can imagine, they could have been used for a pregnant woman. They could be used on a difficult journey. They could be worn day to day. I always ask my students when I teach this material, do you have something you carry with you, a lucky charm, something that you like to have with you, just in case? even if you don't believe it carries any particular power. And most people do, right? They have a lucky necklace, they have a lucky charm on their backpack, they have something that they either like to keep in their house or nearby. So I think this is kind of a universal concept. So now I'm going to turn to the Berlin example and kind of show you in detail some of the features and also how they reveal a little bit about these amulets, because, I mean, there are no signatures here. There's no names of artists or artisans, no names of the places in which these were produced. We know that some were excavated in Egypt, so they were there, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were made there. I'll talk a little bit later about why we think some might have been made in Arabia and some have been found in Syria. But we have no written texts that refer to workshops. We do not know anything about how these were produced. In fact, we don't know what kind of material the blocks were. We think that they might have been wood, but they equally could have been metal. So this is a really surprising mystery, given the numbers of these artifacts which survive. They're exhibited again in every major museum collection, and yet we know so little about how they were made, why they were made, and who made them. So I'm going to use the Berlin Scroll to try to provide some preliminary answers to some of these questions. Others we hope will be answered later on. So looking at the first section of this scroll, right here, this comprises the first print block. And by the way, we can tell where the print blocks are based on how saturated the ink is. Some sections actually overlap, so you can tell what was printed first and what was printed second. Now, if we look in detail here, you see that there are these impressions. Do you see that? So you can probably guess how this happened. This was printed, and you can see that the ink is very black, very saturated here. Okay, they used a lot of ink on the block. It was printed, and then clearly it was immediately folded before the ink had a chance to dry. Okay, so that's why we see this here. And that might seem like, what does that really matter? That's a minor case, but that's actually really important because that tells us that this was immediately folded down and put away in a case. So whoever was going to be using it probably never saw it, at least not for some time after it was produced. And that's really interesting when we think about the density of imagery here. So you can also see that there's some lines. Do you notice those here in the paper? So these are creases from where it was folded. And we can actually recreate the entire folding pattern. It folds down to a size that is consistent with these kinds of cases that I've been showing you. And it's kind of remarkable that most of the amulets that were printed appear to fold down to around the same size. Okay, so they likely all were fitted in these cases. This particular scroll, we don't have a case. And it has no provenance. We have no idea how it got to Berlin, which is unfortunately a recurring problem with artifacts in museums. So really, we're doing detective work here to try to extrapolate what we can from the artifact itself. So it was folded immediately after printing. If we look at the second section of the same print block, okay, we can see here a square. And you can see this is printed a little bit differently. So in this case, you're printing the negative space, okay, rather than the text. So this is called intaglio. So in fact, on the same scroll, we have two different methods of block printing being employed. And this is not uncommon. It happens on many of the other scrolls. Now, just this square has quite a lot of content to it. So we can see, of course, lots of Arabic inscriptions, right? And that's the same for all of these scrolls. So in this outer square, we have a Quranic verse. So for those who are unfamiliar, the Quran is the holiest text in Islam. It's kind of like the Bible in Christianity or the Torah in Judaism. It is employed frequently in a lot of different circumstances, but often for personal protection. Okay, verses of the Quran, particular verses carry particular protective powers, and we'll see that. In addition to that, we have the words the mighty and the wise, and these are names of God. So in the Islamic tradition, God has many names. Sometimes they say 99. There's no like standardized number, but these are attributes of God in the Islamic tradition. And then in the middle, oops, let me go back. We have sovereignty belongs to God. So these amulets draw their power from the divine. And this is the case for quote unquote magic in the Islamic tradition. It does not draw upon malignant forces or demonic forces or negative forces. In fact, magic in the Islamic tradition always draws its power from God. Okay, and this is different from some other traditions. So on these amulets, we have a lot of religious texts, names, phrases, prayers to contribute protection, and all of them printed. Okay, so if we look even more closely, we see that there is an 8-pointed star made of 2 double rotated squares. Okay. Now you also see this on other amulets. So here is another one from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You see that here. That's also at the very beginning of the scroll. Now, many things with the Islamic tradition, when I teach Islamic art, I talk about this. Islamic art did not emerge in a vacuum, right? It did not emerge with a visual culture and artistic tradition fully formed magically, right? It drew upon preceding traditions and selectively adapted them, transformed them, and eventually made their own visual culture. And we can see this even with this 8-pointed star. So the image on the right here, this is from a very famous manuscript, the De Materia Medica, which was a medical text on medicinal herbs written by a Roman physician, Dioscorides. And it was circulated widely in the Roman world, Byzantine world, and the Islamic world. We have Islamic copies, Arabic copies of this manuscript. But this one was produced, okay, under the Byzantine Empire. And it was commissioned by Anicia Juliana, who was the daughter of the Byzantine Emperor Olybrius. Okay. And the beginning of the manuscript has a dedicatory portrait of Anicia Juliana seated here. And you'll notice you have the 8-pointed star made of the double rotated squares. Now, this appears at the beginning of a Byzantine manuscript. It also appears at the beginning of block printed amulet scrolls. And to make a long story short, it appears to be a symbol that was frequently used at the opening of books and texts. And this seems to have entered the Islamic tradition from the Byzantine and Roman tradition. In the Islamic context, it clearly is starting to take on protective qualities. And there, in fact, are some Byzantine examples of graffiti of this symbol on buildings that may have been intended to offer protection. Okay, so we have like a protective symbol, but we also have protective texts at the beginning of the scroll. Now I'm going to skip a section just for the sake of time. I'm going to skip this one and I'm going to go to this one. And you can tell just looking at it without being able to read Arabic, without knowing anything about this, you can tell that this is oriented differently than the rest of the text, right? And the script is much, much bigger. Okay, so here's a detail. Now this, I will tell you, is very hard to read. This is not a particular calligraphic style. This is kind of unique. And this is a question actually I get a lot. In the Arabic Islamic tradition, of course, calligraphy, the arts of writing, was very important, in part because the holiest text in Islam, kind of the Quran, created that tradition, the importance of writing as an art form. Now, often we have very clear calligraphic styles. They can be identified easily. There's connoisseurship of this calligraphy. These scrolls throw that out the window because they're not produced with the pen, right? They're produced through a relief printmaking technique. You have to carve the letters out. It's a very different kind of process. So this does not actually, and I've asked quite a few experts on Islamic calligraphy about this, this does not adhere to any existing calligraphic style, which is quite interesting. It may imply that calligraphers were not working on these kinds of printed artifacts. It is seemingly intentionally difficult to read. It's very stylized letters, right? You can imagine a cursive that's almost illegible. It is, however, possible to decipher it. It took me some time. But this is actually a very short quotation, again from the Quran, and the English translation reads, "And God said, approach and fear not, you are secure." Now, on an amulet intended for protection, you might think, well, of course, protection, perfect. You are secure. God's assurance of protection of the person carrying it. But it's much more complicated than that. Because the thing with these Quranic verses is usually whoever is using this artifact, they would know the Quran. They would probably have most of it memorized, right? And sometimes the verses are meant to signify a broader story. Now, this particular verse comes from a story, and it's a story shared with other religious traditions, other Abrahamic traditions. It's a story of Moses, okay, in Arabic, Musa. And it's a story of when his staff transforms into a serpent, and he is terrified. And God says, "And approach and fear not, you are secure." So that's the context for this verse. And it's interesting because in the Islamic tradition, the rod of Moses is a very powerful relic. And there is a lot, not necessarily so much in the Quran, but in other texts afterwards, on Quranic commentaries, religious texts, that this rod was inscribed with holy names of God and that it was covered in writing. It was a long and thin staff covered in writing, capable of producing amazing feats, okay, and gifted by God. And we might be able to see some parallels between this scroll, a long, thin artifact covered in esoteric writing, calling upon the powers of God. So it seems to be invoking the power of the rod of Moses through this verse. Now, what's really interesting, actually, this is kind of an aside. We actually have serpent rods from the time of Moses. Ancient Egyptian magicians actually used rods like these. This is in the Louvre, by the way. You can go and see it. Rods like these in this form. There is a historical precedent for the use of these kinds of artifacts. So, of course, the scroll does not depict Moses, does not depict the rod. We do have other kinds of depictions of Moses from the Islamic tradition. I'll just show you this one. This is later. This is 15th century, and this was produced in Afghanistan, in Herat. But this is a depiction of Moses and his rod, which in this case looks a little bit more like a dragon because there was quite a heavy Mongolian influence and East Asian influence at this time period in Herat. So it kind of looks like a Chinese dragon rather than a serpent. And then we have the pharaoh here cowering behind his throne. So this is a story that was illustrated. This is a story that was well known. And so we can imagine on this amulet that this particular verse, even though it doesn't even mention the rod explicitly, would evoke these kinds of associations for a medieval Arab audience. Now, there's something else about this section that's kind of interesting and brings us back to the story of the lovable rogue Abu Zaid, the charlatan who produced a false amulet. And that is, if we look between the letters, you see these like yellowish brown washes of color. These were not printed. Okay, these were actually applied by hand. Okay. Now, we don't know because, again, I told you this has not been tested and it doesn't seem like it's ever going to be, unfortunately. It has not been chemically tested to determine what kind of substance was used here. But it seems to really be accentuating the designs, accentuating all of the text, and it appears on all parts of the scroll. But one clue lies in this story of Abu Zaid, because in the text of the Maghamat, in the story of him producing this fake amulet, he writes it with a ink produced from rose water and saffron. And for those of you, I'm sure everyone familiar, you've probably cooked with saffron or maybe you've smelled it. It was used, this is what the saffron looks like, the threads, and this is the saffron plant. Saffron was in the medieval Islamic world. It came from many different parts of the Islamic world. Iran had particularly good saffron. There were other sources. Syria produced saffron. It was used widely in cooking, as a perfume, as a luxury fragrance, but also it carried very strong protective associations, and it was often used as medicine. And I won't go into it too much here, it's a different talk, but we have a lot of texts that tell us for difficulty in childbirth in particular, women should ingest saffron or wear saffron on their bodies. So it's kind of part of this broader constellation of protective practices. And if you mix saffron with water, you create a color that looks an awful lot like this. We have one text that tells us that amulets, printed amulets, were produced using saffron ink. Only one, but still, we have a little bit of a precedent to suggest that perhaps this is saffron, and if it is protective here. It is medicinal here. It carries those associations. Okay, so that was that section of the scroll. And now I'm going to move to the most interesting section by far, which is actually two different print blocks. So this section here. Now, this is where the scroll tells us what it's for. This is where it tells us in no uncertain terms. So you see, again, this yellowish color washed over these headings there. There's 6 of them. Now, the last one you can see, it's unfortunately quite illegible. We can barely make that out. These are the translations of these headings. The first one says, section for the eye and the gaze. Now, you may be able to guess what that refers to. It refers to the evil eye, what we might call in English as the evil eye. And this is a tradition that dates back to the Sumerians, ancient Egypt, in this region, it has a long history and it crosses religious traditions. And actually, that's the subject of my monograph that I'm working on. But I won't go into it for the sake of this talk too much. But it is very interesting that it's first here on the scroll. Next, we have fever. Then we have migraine and throbbing inflammations. Okay. And that is the first print block. And underneath each heading, we have text, Quranic text, almost always, that corresponds really nicely to these headings. So for example, the section on migraine, it is a Quranic verse that refers to a cooling shade under a tree. You can imagine if you've ever had a migraine, being in like a dark and calm and cool environment is particularly useful, right? So in many of these sections, the Quranic verses underneath were clearly selected carefully to add efficacy to that particular concern. Okay. Now the second three sections, obedient children, big worry, right? Increasing income, also big worry. Now the last one is illegible, but from the text underneath it, which is a Quranic verse, I can tell you that it's almost certainly difficult childbirth, which again brings us back to the Maghamat and the story of Abu Zaid. So if we look at these, that the first three are one print block and the second three are another, we can see maybe kind of some themes emerging between these two different print blocks. The second half, these are concerns of the home, okay, that deal with children and livelihood. And the first three, especially these two, are physical complaints, physical concerns. And at this time, the evil eye was primarily a cause of physical afflictions and could cause actually any illness, any and all illness could be the evil eye. You never know. So the first section, the first print block seems to deal with the physical, and the second deals with more concerns of the home and the household and the family. And this is so interesting because this means that you could customize these, that theoretically you could select particular print blocks to target specific ailments you might be concerned about. And that this was comprised of two different, and there are others, by the way, this is just one example. There are others in which they are multiple print blocks. Suggests that perhaps there was some degree of customization or intentionality with the kinds of afflictions that were targeted. Everyone might have different concerns, right? Someone who doesn't have children doesn't necessarily need the second half of this, but they might want to add something else. Now, the last section makes this scroll the most remarkable, and it is singular. It is the only scroll that features this detail. And these are two images, and these are two images of two particular sites. The second image is the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and the first image is in the city of Medina, also in Saudi Arabia. And between these two images, we have Quranic verses again. The first says, and complete the Hajj and Umrah for Allah. And the second says, and whoever fails to complete this obligation, the Hajj and Umrah, then God is free from need of them. Now, just to give you a little bit of context on this, the city of Mecca is the holiest city in the Islamic tradition. Now, this is because this is where the Kaaba is. Okay, the Kaaba, which means cube in Arabic, is a cuboid structure. It's covered with a textile. So what you're looking at is a textile that's laid over it. The textile, for those interested, is called the kiswa. The structure itself is a plain stone underneath. Now, this is a primordial building. This is pre-Islamic, although it has been rebuilt many times. It has been destroyed in war and conflict a few times. But this is believed in the Islamic tradition to be the holiest site. It's the axis mundi. It's the most important site in the world. And it is the direction of Islamic prayer. So Muslims, wherever they are in the world, they turn towards the Kaaba. They turn towards Mecca in prayer. This is also the site that is a mandatory obligation of the Islamic tradition to visit it. Pilgrimage to the Kaaba is listed in the Quran as an obligation. And I just showed you some of those verses on the scroll. When it's done during the particular month, the last month of the Islamic calendar, it's called the Hajj, and it's a much longer undertaking. It can also be done at any time of the year. That's a shorter, more personal journey. That's called the Umrah. Technically, you have to do Hajj, but if you can't do Hajj, Umrah is kind of a good substitute. So the depiction on the Berlin Scroll depicts the Kaaba and the mosque around it. There is a large mosque built around the Kaaba. The other city depicted is the city of Medina. And it is specifically this mosque, which today looks very fancy. It has been rebuilt by the Saudis many times. This is not what it originally looked like. This was actually the Prophet Muhammad, the most important prophet in the Islamic tradition, the mosque that built around his home in Medina. So the first mosque, this was it, based on the scholarly consensus. This is also a site of pilgrimage because you see the green dome? Muhammad is buried there. That is the site of his tomb. Also, two of his successors, Abu Bakr and Omar, are also buried there. So there are 3 tombs within this green dome. So it is a site of Islamic pilgrimage, not mandatory. And it's actually contested, depending on who you talk to. For some people, this is an inappropriate pilgrimage because it's venerating a prophet in a way that may, question the veneration of God. It was depicted, this is an Ottoman depiction, and you can see they've actually put a fiery halo over the tomb. In the Islamic tradition, halos are not circular, they are fire. Okay, it's really interesting. They exist and they denote holy places, but they look a little different. So this was depicted. This is a very important pilgrimage site. Okay, so the Berlin Scroll depicts both of these. Okay, now the only place we see this printed in all of the surviving material culture is on one type of artifact, also printed, and these are pilgrimage certificates. So because the Hajj is a mandatory obligation, you need proof that you did it, especially in the medieval world. You can't take a photo or post it to Instagram. You need proof. So these are actually legal documents, okay, that were produced in Mecca and that they're printed, and then there's a space left for the pilgrim's name and signature of 2 witnesses. So they could be mass produced and then handed out to pilgrims after the completion of the Hajj and carried home as a pilgrimage souvenir, as well as a legal proof of the pilgrimage. And they almost always depict the Kaaba and the Prophet's mosque, and they were printed. Now you can understand why they were printed. You have a lot of pilgrims. You need a lot of pilgrimage certificates. Doing this by hand would be unwieldy, time-consuming, and expensive. So, like the amulet scrolls, they were often block printed during this period. And what's remarkable is the iconography, the imagery is very similar. Even though these are 2 totally different types of artifacts, the amulet scroll does not mention a specific pilgrim. There's no legal language. It's protective. It is not, acknowledging the completion of the Hajj. So this on the right is a drawing of a printed pilgrimage certificate. Some of them are quite difficult to make out based on their fragmentary condition. And this is the depiction of the mosque in Medina. So it's the same site depicted on the Berlin Scroll and on a pilgrimage certificate. And here you can see the 3 tombs. You see them? They look like stepped pyramids. And here they're just rectangles. They're more schematic in this depiction. But they're actually in the same part of the mosque. So you have an arcade of columns around the mosque. You see that here too. You have the courtyard with trees in the courtyard of the mosque, trees here. Okay, and this would be the prayer hall, and you have that here. So you can see, while they're not identical by any means, they are very similar in their depiction. So that's where the tombs were on the Berlin Scroll. On the depiction of Mecca, very clearly here, even though it's damaged, we can see the Kaaba. So to compare it to the pilgrimage certificate, you see the Kaaba here. You see the arcaded mosque around it. See the arcade here. Now there's a lot of stuff around the Kaaba. There's a lot of small shrines and pilgrimage sites around it. There's a semicircular wall here. You see the semicircular wall there. You can see the door of the Kaaba here. You can see the door here. But hopefully you can see that clearly something was happening between these 2 different traditions, and that the Berlin Scroll is actually a rare example of where it appears the iconography, the imagery of pilgrimage certificates were adapted through the medium of block printing to an amulet scroll. There are other amulet scrolls which depict these sites, but never both, and they're never complete. So this is a fragment. You can see how fragmentary it is. This is all we've got, unfortunately, of this amulet scroll. But you see also very clearly the Kaaba here. And you can again see the similarities between these 2 works. This also has those yellow washes, likely saffron. Now, the final sort of interesting point I want to make here is that on the pilgrimage certificates, always, 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 Mecca is first, because Mecca is the holiest site. Medina is second. Okay. On the Berlin Scroll, Medina is first. This is unprecedented on any surviving material culture. The Berlin Scroll, as far as I know, is the only surviving artifact from this time period to depict Medina in a position of prominence over Mecca. So it's reversed. And I'm going to tell you why I think this is the case. Because the pilgrimage certificate is narrating the completion of a journey, and Mecca has to be visited first. Okay, the Hajj has to be completed, or the Umrah, and then you go to Medina. But this is not narrating a journey. This is not telling us the story of a traveler's visit. It seems instead to be harnessing the blessings, the protective powers of the sacred sites in Islam for the carrier, because their very image could bear some of their protective capability. In Arabic, this is called baraka, blessings that are conferred, usually through touch. When you fold the Berlin Scroll, when you fold it down to that little shape that'll fit into that case, the image of Mecca is on the outside. That is what you're touching. That's what's in contact with your body. That's what's in contact with the case. So perhaps this was designed this way and printed this way because it was intended to be used quite differently. And it was intended to offer you the maximum amount of protective content that would be portable, that you could carry with you, that you could take on difficult journeys, maybe take on the pilgrimage, because for some people at this time, it took years to make it to Mecca, and you were lucky if you made it intact. Perhaps it was for every day. The powers of Mecca and Medina could be harnessed for anyone, anywhere. So this one scroll tells us quite a bit. It tells us that there was a demand for the mass production of protective amulets. It tells us that there was likely some level of customization of these artifacts. It tells us that they could also be layered with protective substances, imagery, inscriptions, architectural depictions to amplify their efficacy, that they could be used for a wide array of ailments. And that's the most amazing thing, this was folded immediately after printing. Based on the folding pattern and based on analysis of the paper, this was almost never unfolded. Probably the person who carried it never saw it. It didn't matter. The protective power was in the presence of this content, in the presence of the efficacious images and inscriptions that were printed. And it is through contact and continuous proximity that they functioned. So while for us, the printed content is perhaps most visually stimulating, it was probably never seen. Thank you.
What a wonderful detective story. I think you all would agree. Thank you. Thank you so much. We have time for some questions. There are two mics, and if you could speak directly into the mic and hold it close, I'm sure Dr. Halstead would love to answer your questions.
Thank you, Dick Tracy, for this good journey. Can you talk about papyrus as a paper? Is it a paper?
Yeah, so the question was talking about papyrus, is it paper? What's the relationship between papyrus and paper? That's a really good question. So papyrus is made from the papyrus plant, and that was, of course, most popular in Egypt. So it's a very good question. Now, this was used by the ancient Egyptians. It was used in late antiquity to produce texts, scrolls, all kinds of things. In the Islamic world, when Islam first emerges, which is really the 7th century, a little bit before, a couple centuries before this material, there were basically two options, papyrus or parchment. And parchment, for those who don't know, is animal skin. So you have to raise the animal, you have to take care of the animal, then you have to slaughter the animal, and then clean the skin. Parchment was much more expensive than papyrus, but they both had their sort of shortcomings. So parchment could be relatively sturdy, but it was very expensive and time consuming to produce. Papyrus was a little bit better, but it was not as affordable as paper. It was not as flexible as paper. Some of these amulets would not fold down as nicely with papyrus. It's a stiffer, more rigid material. Now, paper is different because paper, and I should have mentioned this earlier, it was made from rags. You can make it from garbage. So in fact, it's the cheapest of all possible materials. Now, it took some time for paper workshops to develop in the Islamic world and for that to become a mainstream practice. But once it did, it meant the democratization of a writing substrate, that virtually anyone could own a piece of paper that would be relatively inexpensive. And you don't necessarily, I mean, it can be made from wood pulp, but you don't have to. You can make it from cotton rags, linens, disused clothing. And so it was very affordable. And it had a benefit over both papyrus and parchment in that didn't require you to take care of an animal, wasn't very expensive, and was very flexible and could be relatively sturdy. Now, all of the paper used here could be carbon dated because those rags are made from organic material. So we do know there are 2 scrolls that have been carbon dated, only 2. And one of them dates to the 14th century, one of them dates to the 13th century. That only tells us when the paper was made, or rather, when the organic material died. But if we assume that they were used shortly after the paper was produced, then that gives us a date. So we have the adoption of paper around the 10th century. Prior to that, there was still some papyrus usage, but we don't really have any printed materials on papyrus. We do have a couple of printed parchment examples. I think there might be one, maybe one very early papyrus amulet. I don't remember offhand if it was printed, but it's a good question because in Egypt that was a very prevalent material. By this point, paper kind of replaces it.
Yes. Oh, my turn?
Yeah.
As an artist, have you personally experimented with printing, block printing and saffron inks?
That's a really great question. So I'm not a practicing artist. My field is art history, although as a student at Davidson, we had to be an art historian, you have to take 2 studio art courses to understand how these processes work. So I have made a block print before. It's not easy. I'm not artistically gifted, so it really didn't end very well for me. But I have experimented with the physicality of the scrolls. One of the things I'm really interested in is materiality and engagement with the body, and you can probably see that coming through in this talk. So I have created like an analog of this scroll, and I have practiced folding it and unfolding it and seeing, of course, with modern paper, what kinds of wear patterns that produces, what kinds of impressions that produces. And I also have experimented a little bit with saffron ink. Anyone can make it. So I've done a little bit of experimentation, but I'm certainly by no means a practicing artist. So I can't speak to that, although I have consulted with printmakers on some of my analysis of this work.
Do you have a question?
Can you explain the process of intaglia?
Yes, that's a great question. Let me go back to my other.
Tell us what intaglia is.
Yes, I will. Let me go back. So the question was the process of intaglio. Let me go back to my previous slide where I had the example of the relief printing, just so that I can show you, 1 second, how this would work. Because I think with a visual aid, it's a little bit easier to understand. So here, right, most of the scrolls are printed in this way. Here, you draw the design onto you trace it, or you make an impression of the design onto the block, and you carve, you see carving everything except, let's see, is this on? Everything except the image. So the image is not carved out. Everything around it, all the negative space is removed. So that means that the image is at a higher level. Okay, it's in relief to everything around it. And so then you take a ink roller and you apply the ink so it only adheres to the lines that you want to print. And then you print it. Now, intaglio is the reverse. Okay, so in that case, you would carve out all the lines and you would leave all the negative space, and then you print the negative space. Does that make sense? So it could be done through the same process, but it produces the opposite effect. And I didn't mention this, but it's kind of interesting. When you make prints, it's mirrored, it's a reverse. So you have to, if you're doing text, you have to write it backwards, which is maybe another reason why the calligraphy doesn't look quite right, because that's not how you produce Arabic calligraphy. So there is a lot that goes into this process to understanding how the image will turn out, and also probably a lot of trial and error to produce the right effect. And I also didn't mention it, but any of these woodcuts could be printed many, many, many times, but as time goes on, the wood breaks down. So eventually the impressions are blurry, the lines are not so crisp. Like that diamond sutra I showed you, that was probably the first time that was printed. That's a very, very clean print. So there is so much like messy trial and error. It doesn't always come through in like looking at the still images. But yes, in the process of producing, it's quite complicated. So the intaglio is used on some scrolls. There are no scrolls that are exclusively intaglio, but sometimes it's a combination of both.
Is there anything comparable in the West to Mecca? Any place similar, analogous to Mecca?
Great question. And just to follow up on the last question, this is the intaglio here, so this part. The question about Mecca, is there any place in the West equivalent to Mecca? It depends on the tradition you're talking about. In Judaism and Christianity, it would be Jerusalem. In other traditions, other cities, but in the Islamic tradition, Mecca is the holiest city, Medina is second, Jerusalem is third. And what's fourth is debated, maybe Damascus, possibly. But I will say that the mandatory pilgrimage to Mecca is quite an interesting, like from a religious studies perspective, it's quite interesting because it means that every Muslim is required to do this. And failure to do this, unless for health reasons or financial reasons, which are appropriate exemptions, is like a big problem. And so we have mass pilgrimage. I mean, Mecca, the mosque in Mecca today, one of the reasons it's been rebuilt so many times is to accommodate literally millions and millions and millions of people who are there. So there are other pilgrimage sites around the world that attract comparable crowds. And again, Jerusalem is the example I can think of most vividly. But in terms of like the masses, Mecca is somewhat unusual in the sheer quantity of people that arrive there at a very particular time, right? It has to be a particular month. And today that's in the millions. In the medieval world, it was probably in the hundreds of thousands.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been a most exciting program. And did not realize I had made an amulet. We did some block printing here in our own art room a few years ago on linoleum.
Uh-huh.
And I still have mine and I can reprint it every year. And I made a couple of cards at the time and the class did. And I think it'd be fun to do again if maybe Lorraine's class might do that. I don't know. But anyway, I did the Madonna and Child and I used it in all my Christmas gifts. So I guess as a card, to say this was done by, my gift. So I suppose it could be called an amulet of sorts because I did it with love and, send it off to family.
Yeah.
So thank you for this. It is a whole new way to look at it.
Thank
I
you for that
appreciate it.
story. Yeah, that's such an interesting example. I really like that. Yeah, I mean, you may have created prints or created like impressions or seals without realizing, but that desire to like replicate an image and maybe disseminate it, I think is kind of a universal idea that we can still understand today. Okay.
Let's thank Dr. Halstead once again. Such an interesting presentation. Thank you all for coming. Next week, Gail Fulks will be speaking on women.
Oh,
Gail Fulks will be speaking next week on women in sports at Davidson. So please plan to attend.